Thank you all for coming out today. Our petition for safer streets has gathered incredible support. That's the spirit. With this momentum, we'll make our voices heard.
In quiet suburban neighborhoods, power rarely announces itself loudly. It hides behind bylaws, letterhead, and polite smiles that vanish the moment compliance is questioned. Blue Ridge Estates looked like one of those places where everything stayed neat, predictable, and controlled. Lawns were trimmed to regulation height. Driveways were free of anything that didn't fit a curated image. And authority flowed through an HOA that promised order but quietly practiced exclusion. At the center of that control stood a woman who believed rules were weapons, not safeguards. She claimed to protect property values, but her version of protection required selecting who belonged and who did not. Trucks that worked for a living became threats. Labor became an embarrassment. Sweat became a liability. What began as paperwork escalated into targeted enforcement. Violations multiplied. Documentation turned aggressive. Surveillance became obsessive. And beneath the surface, something darker was forming, a campaign built on class resentment, selective punishment, and unchecked authority. What no one in the neighborhood realized was that this war had been declared against the wrong target. The man being pushed, fined, and threatened wasn't powerless. He wasn't isolated, and he wasn't who the HOA president thought he was. Because sometimes, the person you try to remove from a neighborhood is the one who quietly owns it. And sometimes, the rules you weaponize are the same ones that end your reign. The conflict did not begin with shouting or public spectacle. It began with paperwork, timestamps, and a rule buried deep inside HOA bylaws that had never been enforced until the moment it became useful. Blue Ridge Estates had operated for years under reasonable standards, originally designed to prevent chaos rather than control people. That balance ended when new leadership took power. The HOA president's approach was surgical. She did not attack indiscriminately. She targeted specific residents whose livelihoods were visible, audible, and impossible to ignore. Commercial vehicles parked legally in private driveways suddenly became existential threats to the community. Landscaping trailers, electrical vans, plumbing trucks, these were labeled eyesores despite existing peacefully for years. The pattern became impossible to ignore. White-collar professions were left untouched. Medical vehicles remained overnight without consequences. Home offices operated openly. Accounting cars displayed business branding without scrutiny. Meanwhile, tradespeople received violation notices at dawn, photographed from multiple angles, documented with obsessive consistency. This was not enforcement, it was filtration. The escalation followed a familiar authoritarian rhythm. First came warnings, then came fines, then came threats of legal action and involvement of county authorities. The goal was not compliance, the goal was removal. What the HOA president underestimated was the discipline of someone trained to observe patterns, document inconsistencies, and wait. Years of military experience had taught that the most dangerous enemy is the one convinced of their own righteousness. While violations were being issued, evidence was being gathered. Photographs were catalogued. Dates, times, and license plates were logged. Public social media posts were archived. HOA communications were preserved. The evidence told a story the HOA could not erase. Enforcement applied only to one demographic. Rules were invoked selectively. Language shifted depending on profession. Praise followed white-collar business growth. Threats followed blue-collar expansion. The discrimination was not subtle, it was structural. As the harassment intensified, the HOA president expanded her reach. Neighbors were recruited as informants. Surveillance became routine. Early morning photography turned driveways into crime scenes. HOA meetings became echo chambers reinforcing one narrative, that working vehicles were destroying the neighborhood. But the deeper the campaign went, the more visible its cracks became. County records revealed unpermitted construction tied directly to the HOA president's own property. Financial statements hinted at unexplained administrative fees flowing into her real estate business. HOA funds were being treated as personal resources rather than communal trust. Simultaneously, another truth surfaced quietly through property management reports. Ownership distribution within the neighborhood was not equal. Several homes were held under a single investment entity. That entity possessed not just voting influence, but contractual authority inherited from the original developer, authority designed to prevent discriminatory enforcement. And at the center of that entity was the same man being targeted. The realization changed everything. The violations were no longer just harassment. They were leverage attempts against someone who legally outranked the HOA president herself. Every fine issued, every threat mailed, every public accusation had been funded unknowingly by the very person she was attacking. Because the HOA president was not just a leader. She was a tenant. And she had been paying rent for years to the man she believed she was crushing. Once the imbalance of power was understood, restraint became the strategy. Immediate retaliation would have ended the conflict quickly but quietly. Allowing the campaign to continue would expose it publicly, permanently, and irreversibly. The decision was made to let the system indict itself. The HOA president escalated, confident that momentum favored her. Emergency meetings were scheduled, petitions circulated, media attention was invited. The narrative was framed as community protection, but the language revealed something else entirely. Fear replaced facts. Property values were weaponized. Working people were framed as intruders. Behind the scenes, documentation reached a critical mass. Trespassing footage surfaced. Late-night surveillance was recorded. Bribery attempts were captured legally. County inspectors confirmed harassment claims. Financial irregularities within HOA accounts became impossible to dismiss. Everything converged toward a single public moment. The emergency town hall meeting was presented as a final judgment. Cameras were positioned. Residents filled the seats. The HOA president prepared to deliver what she believed would be a decisive victory. Instead, the meeting became a controlled detonation. Legal counsel intervened before any vote could proceed. Voting rights were challenged. Stakeholder authority was introduced. Developer agreements were cited. Enhanced voting power was revealed. Veto authority surfaced. The room shifted from anticipation to disbelief. Property ownership records were entered into the record, one address after another connected to the same owner. 8 properties, 12% voting control, legal override privileges. Then came the final disclosure. The HOA president's own address appeared among those properties. Her authority collapsed in real time. The woman enforcing compliance was in violation of her own lease. Unauthorized modifications, covenant breaches, financial misconduct, discriminatory enforcement, each revelation dismantled another layer of credibility. The media captured everything. What followed was not revenge, it was consequence. The HOA vote was nullified, leadership was dissolved, legal proceedings began, eviction notices were prepared, county investigations expanded, HOA funds were frozen, charges were filed. The illusion of power evaporated under exposure. Because the HOA president had mistaken visibility for authority, paperwork for power, and intimidation for control, she never realized the ground beneath her position was owned by the person she attempted to remove. Justice rarely arrives quietly, but it often leaves quietly. In the months following the meeting, Blue Ridge Estates transformed, not through celebration, but through correction. Eviction proceedings concluded without spectacle. Legal investigations advanced methodically. Licenses were suspended. Assets were seized. The former HOA president exited the neighborhood without ceremony, leaving behind fines, charges, and a reputation permanently attached to abuse of power. The neighborhood recalibrated. New leadership emerged from those previously silenced. Enforcement standards were rewritten with transparency. Rules were applied equally or not at all. Documentation was shared publicly. Appeals processes were formalized. The culture shifted from control to coexistence. The most significant change was not procedural, it was psychological. Tradespeople parked without fear, residents stopped whispering, surveillance ended, the neighborhood rediscovered balance. Property values did not fall. They rose. The story reached far beyond Blue Ridge Estates. News coverage spread nationally. The case became a reference point in HOA law discussions, legal seminars, and community advocacy groups. It demonstrated what happens when unchecked authority meets documented reality. Out of the conflict came something lasting. Scholarships were established, trade education was funded, apprenticeships were supported, young workers were reminded that dignity does not come from appearance, but contribution. The man once targeted became a quiet anchor for stability, not through dominance, but through accountability. Ownership was never used to intimidate. Authority was never weaponized. The lesson was not about winning, it was about exposure. Communities do not fail because of work trucks. They fail because of unchecked power. And sometimes, the person you attempt to erase from a neighborhood is the one holding the deed to your authority, your position, and your consequences. Because real power does not shout. It waits. And when it speaks, it does not need permission.